Welcome to Tuesday night dinner. It's September 27th, and we are blessed to have our friend Berkely Hudson to talk about his book Possum Town. And he and Milbury, his partner, have been longtime friends of Binkley. They were here in person 1999 to 2003, and their daughters experienced the Christian formation here. This book is an amazing book. It's for sale after, and I hope that we can learn much from this experience. Thank you. I'm going to offer a brief prayer of blessing. Gracious God, we thank you for this beautiful day, splendid blue skies. We pray for those in Florida who are in Cuba, who've just gone through the hurricane. We pray for their safety and well-being. And we thank you for this food, all the way from Peru. Amen.
So we're going to watch a brief video about 4 minutes long that explains aspects of the Pruitt project. And before we do that, I just want to say how delighted I am to be here with all of you, and I appreciate your being here. So, we're going to start the video by my pressing a button. Sound is not turned up.
The Pruitt images illuminate not only the past, but they illuminate the present in terms of providing a window, a doorway into understanding what we can learn from a highly racially segregated environment in Northeast Mississippi in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. These pictures tell an amazing story that goes back in time, and it also comes forward to this very day that I sit here in time.
This photographer was not specifically looking at race in America. What he was doing was looking at America. He was looking at a town in the South, in Mississippi. He did not seem to have a motive or a thesis. All he was doing was showing life.
He obviously had an urge and a desire to make a record. It may not be any different than somebody who wants to go to their diary and write 3 sentences, but it's a photographic version of that. And I think that that the accretion of doing that over and over and over again in the same place is really the genius of it.
Viewing race or having access to discussions about race through this type of collection is so valuable because it reminds us that race is actually part of the fabric of the life of this town.
The range of emotions and people and places is deeply touching, and thankfully Pruitt bore witness to those moments with his camera. To have all of those photographs carefully preserved and now studied and presented as they've been is truly a national treasure.
It benefits so much from the commitment of those that acquired the collection to really work it, to really put it out there, to understand it, but also to share it.
It's a partnership between this magnificent photography of Pruitt, the amazing archivists who are working on it, and scholars like Berkely Hudson, who has devoted his life to preserving and to transforming this material which is part of his heritage as a Mississippian, and sharing it with the world.
I'm excited by the potential of this collection to change the perspective of the viewers, to allow access to deeper engagement in this issue as not a Black people issue, not a people of color issue, but as an American issue.
I think anyone who takes the time to just look slowly, look deeply at the Pruitt photographs will be rewarded in ways that it's hard to imagine until you have that experience. It's like a deer coming up to a pond of cool water and just drinking deeply from it. And that's what that experience can be like.
It's a little bit like the telegraph back in the old days, you know, sometimes the message doesn't quite go through. They have to resend it.
You remember that, huh?
Back in the 1800s, I was there. Okay. So this is a panorama photograph of downtown Columbus, Mississippi, where Owen Pruitt studio was. My house was about, my house was like 4 blocks down that street there. That's where I grew up. My grandmother's house was around the corner. My aunts and my uncles, they were all lived nearby. My family, a lot of them came there in the 1830s and 40s. And then some of them came later. So it's the idea of listening to the pictures. What do you hear? What do you see? What do you taste? What do you touch? What do you feel? What do you smell? What strikes you in your head? What strikes you in the heart? William Faulkner talked about the human heart in conflict with itself. And that's what I discovered as I began to dig into these negatives, was what that looked like in a visual form. And that's why the title of the book has Trouble, and that's why the title of the book has Resilience. Pruitt was unusual in that he was a white man who worked in a highly racialized environment, but he photographed both white folks and Black folks, though admittedly the Black culture that he photographed was not as complete as white culture that he photographed. But he was unusual for a white photographer in that he did move in the Black community. He was trusted enough to make photographs in church settings, in home settings. And you'll see, and maybe you've already seen, how he photographed in the studio. And I say that in many ways, separate and sometimes equal, is how Pruitt functioned as a photographer. But there's an incredible respect that he shows to whoever is sitting before his camera. And that had to do with class also. You see tattered clothes that people are wearing, and their picture is just as well done as somebody who's in a fine tailor-made suit. So we're going to go through a set of images and some ideas. I like to say, and you can tell that I'm kind of slowing down right now, is I would suggest, and I suggest to anyone, and if you get the book, just find a picture that you're drawn to and look at that. We really go fast now. But if you slow down, I think you'll make some discoveries about yourself. I think it doesn't matter what your political beliefs are, or your religious beliefs and background is, or your identity, or how you identify yourself, or how others identify you. I do think that there's something to be discovered in these photographs, and it's not just a Mississippi thing. It's just not a Southern thing. I've had people from Brazil that have looked at the pictures and they made the connection to the African diaspora with Brazil. I've had people from all over the country look at the pictures and they make connections. So it really just has to do with the willingness to look at the pictures. So I'm going to go slowly through some pictures in the beginning, and I won't say much about some of them. The other thing is every person in this room brings to this their own perceptions and backgrounds. So I'm really not, again, in the business of telling you what to think, though admittedly in my book I do tell you some things that I've discovered. But I am telling you what to think about. So I like this notion that photographs are better at raising questions than answering them. They can reveal what you do not understand and also alert you to things that you take for granted. And I realize you all can read this, but sometimes I think it's important just to give voice to what the words say. I will say this is the Tupelo Tornado of 1936. There were more than 200 people that were documented as being killed. It was considered, depending on how it's counted, either the second or the fifth worst tornado in U.S. history. Elvis was 15 months old. He did not die in the tornado. The other thing, Pruitt has made photographs of the tornado that included a makeshift morgue of black bodies that were there. Minrose Quinn, some of you may know, who was an English professor at UNC, wrote a novel that came out a few years ago called Promise, and she uses some images that Pruitt made, and she tells the story of a black family and a white family, and she gets into the whole question of how blacks were undercounted after the tornado. So this is Pruitt with his son and with his brother. So it's sort of like with the small town photographers back in the early 20th century. It's like the equivalent of people who got a domain name early on in the internet. in the 90s, say. So they got cameras. And a lot of the people who were photographed for Pruitt had never had their pictures made. There was not this kind of thing. You can make a panorama with this, but it's different from the panoramas that Pruitt made, because he could only make like 1 or 2 images. So his approach in some ways was also like a meditation. You would only make 1 or 2 images of any particular person. I mean, sometimes I'll find like rich people paid him, and so there's like a dozen pictures that he made of him. But most of the times, there's only 1 or 2 images of whoever he photographed. I've thought a lot about and tried to find a lot about, like, well, what did Pruitt think? What was his belief system? I can tell you, he went to the Methodist church, that he drank a little Mogan David wine before he went to bed, and that he told what was referred to back then as smutty jokes among his men friends. But he was liked by everybody in town, and he was called Mr. Pruitt. And that his wife ran the business side of things, and that if she hadn't have done that, he'd have gone bankrupt a long time ago. So this is a picture of my family, my maternal grandmother's family in her home. She used to have Pruitt come there and take our picture at Christmas and Thanksgiving. I'm the smallest person in the room. I'm in my mother's lap, and it doesn't take a psychologist to understand that explains a lot about me. And partly when I became a journalist, and I learned to just shut up and listen to the stories that other people would tell, because all the other people were just talking, and they didn't. I mean, they thought I was cute and I'm a baby and all that. But anyway, so those are my aunts, my uncles, my brothers. So Pruitt took my picture for like the first 9 years of my life, 8 or 9 years of my life. Columbus is kind of an intriguing place. I had a professor at UNC, Joel Williamson, who talked about the crucible of race, and how the crucible also is where arts and literature came out of in terms of the South. It's kind of amazing. So Tennessee Williams was born in Columbus. Red Barber was born in the Columbus around the same time as Tennessee Williams. So essentially they were toddlers at the same time. I don't know if they were in a play group. Dr. Emmett Stringer was president of the Mississippi NAACP in a signature year, 1954. That's when Thurgood Marshall was coming to Mississippi to help. Dr. Stringer, I interviewed him a year before he died. He told me some stories about the difficulty he had, and there's a section in the book called the Racial Crucible. And but what Dr. Stringer did not tell me was that he was on the Ku Klux Klan assassination list, and that his wife, who had graduated from Columbia University Teachers College with a master's degree, lost her job when Dr. Stringer became president of the NAACP. Dr. Stringer lost his insurance. He and his wife and their children moved into a middle bedroom because they were afraid of Molotov cocktails coming into their home. So these photographs allowed me to discover stories about the town that I'd never heard as a child, who was supposedly this precocious history student in junior high and high school. But I never heard a lot of these stories because people didn't talk about them. You'll see some other names. Henry Armstrong, who he was a black boxer who had held 3 titles at one time. He was born in Columbus. He wrote a book called God, Guts, and Glory. He ended up living in Los Angeles and became kind of a preacher after his boxing career. Faulkner had relatives. He used to come to town there. Newell Niles Puckett wrote a dissertation that was published by UNC Press in 1926. He grew up in Columbus. His family was wealthy. They owned the Brickyard. He wrote a collection that's somewhat controversial among folklorists today because he was a white man, but he wrote about hoodoo and voodoo, and a lot of the people that he interviewed were from that area.
Charles Henry Ford was considered the first surrealist poet in the United States. He lived in the Dakota for many years. He was a teenager in Columbus. I can't tell the whole story of Charles Henry. His sister Ruth also lived in Columbus. She was an actor, lead on Broadway of Requiem for a Nun, which she co-wrote with William Faulkner. Big Joe Williams, Bucka White, and Howlin' Wolf all lived around Columbus. Big Joe wrote Baby Please Don't Go. It's been covered 500 times by other artists, many you'd be familiar with. So this is Tennessee Williams with his grandfather, who was Walter Dakin, who was the rector for the Episcopal Church. And then there's a lay leader there, Davis Patty. I was just in the home where that photograph was made. So here's Eudora Welty talking about this idea of like, well, she was a photographer actually during the Works Progress administration, and just what her aim was, in some ways similar to Pruitt's, but different. Eudora Welty lived in Columbus, Mississippi for 2 years in the 1920s. So far, I haven't found her picture. And oh yes, all the negatives are in Wilson Library. There's 88,000 of them, and then another 50 or 60,000 from Pruitt's assistant. So I did a lot of this work before Google. Myself and my friends, we got the collection in 1987 after trying for 13 years to get the collection. Pruitt lived from 1891 to 1967. So I found a print of this picture, and it didn't have any information on it about who it was, but eventually after 10 years I found out that's Sylvester Harris, and that's his mule Jesse. That's his home. He and his brother owned about 130, 140 acres, unusual for black folks, though certainly blacks did own their own farms. And Sylvester couldn't make his mortgage payments, so he had heard the fireside chats from Franklin Roosevelt. He decided to ride into town. He got on the telephone. It took him 90 minutes, and he reached Franklin Roosevelt on the phone, told him the problem, and the president said, "I'll help you," and he did. After that, Sylvester went viral. Pruitt took this picture. It ended up on in the New York Times. It ended up in the New York Herald Tribune. It ended up in black newspapers all over the country. The Chicago Defender, one of the main ones. Memphis Minnie wrote a song, Sylvester and His Mule Blues. Fox Movie Tone and Paramount News reels came to Columbus. Sylvester was played in the theaters in Times Square in New York and all over America, telling the story about a spunky black farmer who became a folk hero, particularly among black Americans struggling during the Depression. Oh, and how does this connect with anything? This is yesterday's Wall Street Journal. Black farmers skeptical about aid. So it's a story about, and actually the photographs are Mississippi farmers here, talking about, well, they're glad that something passed, but they don't really know if it's going to really help them or not. So it's been a struggle for decades and decades and decades. The exhibit in Missouri, this Pruitt exhibit is there at the State Historical Society. There's a companion exhibit from Cropperville in the Boot Hill in Missouri, 1939. Black sharecroppers and some white sharecroppers staged a strike. Cropperville, 1939, Boot Hill. Sylvester connects. There was a zoo owned by one of the richest white men in town. I write about that in the book. And the man who was actually accused of murdering another man, and he was acquitted, the white man who owned the camel in the zoo. This is Oscar West. It's another one of these 10-year projects. I ended up finding an old white woman, Ms. Brown, who says, "Oh yeah, that's Oscar. He took care of my children, and he was the cleanup boy, as he was referred to, at the Brown Buick Cadillac Company. He's no boy in this picture; he's a man." And I ended up talking to one of his children, his son, who had never seen this picture of Oscar. I have no idea why the picture was made. I just know that Oscar's on the same rug as everybody else. black or white, who came into the studio. Jack Dempsey's in the center. Truman Capote's mother is there to your left, and then Madame Flozella is right next to Jack Dempsey. A strange configuration of all these folks came to town to bury the great Pasha alive. Jack Dempsey, Truman Capote's mother, that's Truman Capote's father next to Madame Flozella in the white hat. And Truman Capote ended up 17 years later. Truman Capote was not there. He was about 5 years old. He was in Monroeville, Alabama. But he ended up writing a story about a buried alive act called A Tree of Night that appeared 17 years after these photographs, which haven't been published until my work. That's another 10-year project of figuring out who all those people were in the picture. So this is the troubling evidence section. So I'm going to show you some photographs of blackface minstrelsy. I'm going to show you a photograph before James Keaton, a black man, was executed after being convicted of murder. In the book, I talk about a white woman who went to James's jail cell the night before, where he told Sarah Lusky, says, "I did not murder that man." There are many blackface photographs in the collection. This is one that's on glass. There are 2,000 glass plate negatives in the collection. The next image of James Keaton, 1934, on the courthouse grounds. He was executed by rope hanging. The next image is of the Ku Klux Klan March, 1922, and highlighted there is the Pruitt studio sign that's there on Main Street. These, I'm sorry. These are the front pages of the local newspaper. I came upon them. I was going through just trying to find a lot of Pruitt pictures, and somebody had cut out the front page, both of these, one day after the next. And eventually I found out that there was stories about the lynching of Bert Moore and Dooley Morton, 2 young black farmers who were lynched by a mob of 36 white people in 1935 in July. I'm not showing you that photograph. It is in the book. That photograph that Pruitt made ended up on the front page of the Chicago Defender, the main black newspaper of the country, one of the main ones. And it said, had a caption that said, "White civilization, we don't want to show these pictures to you any more than you want to look at them, but you need to see this photograph." So what happened was the photograph was also used by white supremacists. It was also used by black activists. As recently as last year, it was used in the CNN documentary on Marvin Gaye called What's Going On. If you saw the James Baldwin documentary, I'm Not Your Negro, the Pruitt image showed up in that. In the 1960s, it was used by SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as a voting rights poster that was up on the wall that just said the words Mississippi against it. It was used in the Democratic Convention when the Freedom Democratic Party was trying to unseat the white segregationist members of the Democratic Party. It was the image of Bert Moore and Dooley Moore was on a placard outside the convention hall. This is a death certificate of Dooley Morton. It says he died by lynching by a mob. I could not find a death certificate for Bert Moore. So you wonder why the lynchings are not documented any more thoroughly than they are. So Mississippi Vital Record says there is no document, there's no lynching document of death certificate for Bert Moore. But we have a photograph and we know Bert Moore died. So to shift things a bit, at the same time of this racial violence, I found these photographs that completely confounded what I understood about the place where I grew up. So this is a black church group on the left, and then You can't see them, but there are white people behind them, a white church group. On the right is the white church group, and then you can see back in the back is this same black church group. So they would come to the Tombigbee River and baptize at the same time, one after the other. I don't know who went first. All I know is there were photographs, and I have about 8 of them. And Charles Wilson, a friend of mine who's at the University of Mississippi, has said he's never seen photographs like this. Bill Ferris I was on a panel with him recently in Mississippi, and he says, well, in the 19th century, there were times where black and white, Christians would be together, but that's obviously the exception rather than the rule. It's also very different from, say, like if you read about colonial Williamsburg or colonial Virginia, where there's like a black balcony, in a white church. My mother had never told me about this. I showed her these pictures when she's in her 80s. She says, oh yeah, we used to go down there and watch the baptisms all the time. I never heard about it until I showed her these pictures, and she says, yes, they happened all the time. So there was some common ground that was around the notions of Christianity where they met at the riverside. On the right is the James Mann family in 1948. On the left, I don't know the name of this group. I just know the name of one old white woman there that I used to know, Miss Betts, Miss Stokes. I can't remember what her last name was. Anyway, what's interesting to me is if you read Bell Hooks, who's a wonderful theorist, she talks about the role of the photograph in the black family and how it gave a lie to the whole white supremacist argument that black families were not coherent, that black men weren't taking care of their families, and that photographs give the lie to that and provide a sense of community and solidity within the black family. I don't know who these two people are. I just know Pruitt made their pictures in the 1920s. So myself and my friends had a lot of struggles with these photographs. We didn't even realize how many there were. We had them stored in different places, including in Birmingham, Alabama. There was a big storm, tornado. A lot of the negatives got wet. We had to wash them. We began to start to see we needed help. We couldn't figure out what to do. This is where some of them were on Main Street in Columbus. In 2005, when Katrina came to New Orleans, it also came a lesser version up to Columbus. And the windows blew out on the second floor. Some of the negatives, were subject to the wind and the rain. And at that point, we've been looking for a home, and we found a home in Chapel Hill, North Carolina at UNC, which understood the value of something like this. I'll just leave it at that. That's where they are now. So they were appraised, and this was the determination and the appraisal. And here's what some of the glass plates look like on the 4th floor Wilson Library. I had the good fortune to work with a woman named Deborah Willis, who's considered the international expert on black photography. She was my teacher at UNC. She had a joint appointment at Duke and UNC. And she really helped me tremendously. I talk about that in the book. When she saw this picture, she just said, Chicago bound. And really, I don't know his name, but he knew how to dress and he knew how to pose for the camera. And Pruitt knew how to take a picture. This is another mysterious pairing. Is the person from Meridian here tonight? No. Nope? Okay. Well, I played a Jimmy Ryder's song for them.
I'll tell him.
Tomatoes. Mississippi State Fox Hunting Association. The National Fox Hunting Association had its convention there right around that same time. But the next one I'm going to show you is what's called a freak show. And I write about that in the book, how that fits in with that time period and connects with the Chicago World's Fair and the whole idea of exotic and who's different and who's on the margins, who's not. And the pandemic caused a lot of problems with the book and the exhibit, but the gift the pandemic gave me was I couldn't go in Wilson Library for 2 years while I was putting the book together, but I got a cache of like 2,000 scans, and this was one image in the 2,000 scans. And what I hadn't realized is that Pruitt made individual portraits of the people in the freak show. The next slide is of a post-mortem of a child. He made lots of pictures of funerals and casket pictures. There's a long tradition in the U.S. and all over the world for photographing the beloved. And that's a mirror on the coffin there that allows people to see just the mirror image. This is a church out in the country. It's no longer there. A tornado blew it away about 10 years ago. I've not been able to find out who they are. I'd love to know their stories and who they became. These are bees on Main Street. So this is part of a National Endowment for Humanities project. I got a grant, 2 grants from the NEH that helped fund a traveling exhibit which opened in Mississippi and now is in Missouri. There's a website, pruittproject.com, which is, you can go on there. It's fairly up to date, and I'm starting to load in more things into that. I have a documentary crew that will be going this weekend to Mississippi. We've been interviewing people throughout the town to make connections between the past with the present in terms of Columbus. Columbus is about 25,000 today, about 65% black, 35% white. The county has about 60,000 people, and it's kind of flipped. It's about 60% white, 35% black. It's near the Alabama border, 60 miles west of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And here's the book. So, if you got questions, I may have answers and I may not. And there's no bad questions. There's only good questions. All questions are good. Yes?
So I saw just in one of the last slides that he did private and commercial photography. Okay.
Can I get you to speak into?
Yeah, but I may have
What?
background noise.
It's okay.
It's pretty loud. So I saw that there's private and commercial photography that he did. I'm just curious, like when I looked at the freak show portrait, is that done probably for the individual, or is that done out of his own interest?
I think they did it because they wanted him to do it because you could make money from it.
Okay.
So there's a tradition that goes from like Matthew Brady on Broadway in New York in the 19th century, where he teamed up with Barnum and would photograph, Tom Thumb. What I was surprised to learn is that people would go to the freak shows, even in the 1930s, and the local photographer would make pictures of it, and there'd be a stack of them there, and then the freaks would sign you know, they would sign the print, and then the people would put that like in their family album next to grandma and grandpa.
So it wasn't just for the individual, it was a profit-making venture.
Right. I mean, again, I'm telling you, there was that tradition in photography.
Yeah.
So, and back then it was unusual to have tattoos. So you saw the tattooed man.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Berkley, can you remind us how you came about finding the photography? Yeah.
Well, I was a photographer and editor in my high school. I was editor of my high school paper. I was taking pictures. Another friend, Bernie Imes, who became a famous photographer, did a book called Juke Joint that's well known. He was taking pictures, and then another friend, Mark Gooch.
I'll make the Binkley connection. So Brooke Wheeler's uncle, if anybody knows Brooke, who was here. So her uncle,
Mark was taking pictures. So Mark got an ADH youth grant after when he was at Sanford and Birmingham, and he was doing interviews on Catfish Alley, which is on the cover of the book, the black strip of businesses in town. And so he went to Pruitt's assistant, because he thought he might have some pictures of Catfish Alley. And when he got up there, Calvin Shanks, the assistant, showed him, well, I've got all these pictures that Pruitt made, you know, just in boxes like you saw kind of in the picture with me with the negatives. So it took us about 13 years. Calvin ended up dying. We asked Calvin to sell them. He didn't want to sell them. Then his widow sold them to Bill Fraser, like Train Pictures, a guy who had a hardware store with his mother who also had a knit and yarn store together. He kept them for 4 years, and finally he sold them to us in 1987. And then at that time, Jim Carnes, a friend of ours, had gone to UNC in the 70s, and then Dave Gooch, who's also Brooke Wheeler's uncle. Dave Gooch joined with us, so there were 5 of us who realized that this was the, what I'm calling, what my great professor at UNC helped me understand, a guy named Don Shaw, who said, well, this is like a photobiography of your town. And it's a story that's told visually, it's not told in any other way. So, I was living in Rhode Island and in Los Angeles, but over the years, we've done some work and we brought it to UNC, and then my partners are still out there and doing good work and have come to the exhibit in Mississippi, but I'm kind of like doing the book and the exhibit and all that now. So it's been a 35-year journey, or if you add another 13 years, I guess it's 48.
How would we get this exhibit here?
Well, I'd love to have your help. It's designed by a foremost exhibition company called Curatorial. They're based in Pasadena, California. Deborah Willis, my mentor, referred me to them. They had toured her exhibit, Posing Beauty, and then another exhibit, Reflections in Black, which was based on her groundbreaking book that came out in the year 2000, which told the story of black photography that dates to the beginning of photography, which is a story that hadn't been told. And so she referred me to Curatorial. They've done exhibits at the Getty, the Met, Smithsonian, all that. So it's a matter of fundraising to get the exhibit wherever it is, and it's $16,500 for 100 images for 3 or 4 months, and then a shipping fee. As people point out, there are speakers that come to UNC that get paid $25,000 for 2 hours. So it's all a matter of what value someone places in their corporate sponsorships and that sort of thing. And I've gotten grants from like the Mississippi Humanities Council, just got a small grant from the Missouri Humanities Council, the North Carolina Humanities Council would perhaps contribute. So I'm happy to work with you about how to get it here, including maybe in the Ackland or the Nasher. Bill Ferris has been a great help to me. As I was explaining to you, I have to deal with the turnover that happens institutionally. The wonderful head librarian and assistant provost
Elaine Westbrook's just left here. She was here for like 5 years. She just went to Cornell. So I'm always kind of like introducing myself and say, oh, by the way, these are in Wilson Library, and we really need to get them shown. So, but it's a great question. I'm not sure where it's going from Missouri next, but it's a nationally traveling exhibit. That's the idea. Yes?
These photographs are in black and white, and I'm just wondering, had they been in color, would it have changed your interest in this project?
No, not if it captured the range that this captures.
I just wondered if the black and white captured.
Well, no, the black and white is the prints. When you see the prints, when people go to this exhibit and they see the prints, they are stunning. The prints are stunning. But they would be stunning. A large format camera in colors also makes a stunning image. You could blow these. So this is 8 by 10, 8 inches by 10 inches negatives compared to like a little like 35 millimeter. You can blow up the side of that wall, the size of that wall over there, and it really pops. You can see, you can read your shirt, the writing on your shirt. I was able to look at license plates and see what year the car was to help figure out, okay, this picture's not from 1932. Car's got a 1932 license plate. You can see whether somebody was a Mason. You can see, you can read all kinds of things. So it's the quality of the images and the content. So, I mean, color photography. One of the most famous color photographers is from Mississippi, Louis Edelston. His work was displayed in the 1970s at the Museum of Modern Art. It was criticized by the New York Times when it came out in color. Now, photography's changed radically. So it has to do with the content and then the quality. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
How do you find Columbus, Mississippi today?
How do I find it
versus?
I mean, what is Columbus like?
Yes.
Okay, so there's a video where I say something like it's radically different today. It is radically different. I was just on my daughter works at the Aston Institute in London, and she had a Zoom today with experts in the UK talking about design for diversity and what's diversity like. And there was an older man, I think he may have been a Pakistani scholar, and he was saying, addressing the same question, well, how are things different? And there were young people in there saying, well, he said, listen, it's really bad. It's really better than when I was young and there was hockey bashing going on, but they still need to change. So, Columbus, James Fallows and Deborah Fallows wrote a book about towns in America that are trying to change and reinvent themselves, and Columbus was one of them that they selected. So there's a dynamic that's there, but Columbus had 100 antebellum homes that were built in the 1840s that are still there because it was in the eye of the Civil War hurricane. So it was 100-something miles from Shiloh was the closest real battles. And so these homes were, Sherman had to go through there. So there's this long-time pilgrimage that Pruitt used to photograph, the pilgrimage of these antebellum homes. And just recently, there was tension among the homeowners about how do we acknowledge the house out back, how do we acknowledge enslavement. And so this year, I think they had this fellow, I think his name is Joe Bell, maybe, and he's going around the country sleeping in former enslaved quarters of the enslaved, and he's giving workshops about it. And so that was a shift that's been happening, and just happened this year with the antebellum pilgrimage. I've got a friend who's a novelist who was on a panel at the University of Mississippi with me. She's a black woman named Deborah Johnson. She was on the panel with me, and she serves as a host at an antebellum home in Columbus now. So that's different. With Summer Weapons, I'll say, as a Cub Scout, I served at an Annabelle home in what was called a Confederate uniform. Wasn't a Confederate uniform. Anyway, I mean, it's different. There's one of my classmates who's unfortunately passed away a few years ago was among the first black city councilmen. We had a maid that I talk about in my book. Her name was Louisville. Her daughter-in-law was one of the first black councilwomen on the council in Columbus. So in terms of race, things have changed. But it's America. It's America. It's Mississippi. Mississippi has, you saw the woman, the black woman, sitting on the porch steps of the unpainted house, and I discovered she's was a midwife, and I'm working on getting her name now. Okay, so midwifery. I read the stories about healthcare in Mississippi. Mississippi had the per capita, the largest number of stillbirths per capita of any place in the country. Mississippi has the largest number per capita of confined people in jails and prisons per capita of any place in the world, including Saudi Arabia, China, and Iran. So it's better, but there's a long way to go, and it's a process. Change is a process that can be exhausting and rewarding. Yes?
The photo that appeared on the Chicago Defender, I'm curious about that one. You didn't show it in the slideshow, but this is before Mamie Till lets Emmett Till's photo.
It's 20 years before.
20 years before. So does Pruitt know that it's going to go?
I think
like
so.
that?
I think so.
And did he sell it?
I think he probably did sell it. Acme Pictures was a distributor of the image. And that's, when you look at the Chicago Defender, I can send you the front page, you can see it, and it says Acme Pictures. I haven't had time, actually, to look at all the other places where that Acme Pictures image might have appeared. I've looked at a lot of places where the lynching image has appeared. So the other issue is, and I don't pin it down completely in the book. So I had an uncle who worked for Pruitt in the 20s, and so I asked him about it. I asked Pruitt's touch-up artist who was there in the 40s. I asked about the lynching image. I asked a lot of people about it. And so he did have postcard-sized images, but I never found a postcard that were in a drawer. And so I got enough from my uncle and this other woman to say, okay, he had them in a drawer. If somebody asked, he would show it to them. I've never found that he sold them. I haven't found them. So I was on a panel in the year 2001, I think, at Emory University on racial violence with James Allen, who did the Without Sanctuary book. If you've seen that, it's a horrific book. It's 190 lynching postcards. I talked in my book about how the Postal Service banned them in like 1908, I think it was. So that's what I know. Pruitt didn't keep diary. He was, So I said what I could feel like I could say, I just said it to you. I can't say, I've been trying to develop a relationship with the black church. That's where the lynching occurred in the churchyard. There's a book that I refer to in my bibliography called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. About 20 years ago, I tell this in there, a white man and a black woman both approached me when I was working on a dissertation because I had a story in the local papers and I wanted to talk to people, and I made a reference to a lynching image. I didn't say when it was or anything, but they surfaced, and they said they both wanted a copy of it, independent of one another, for different reasons. The white man lived in a house where a white woman had lived that provoked the lynching, partly, and the black woman was a member of the church where the lynching had occurred. Ever since then, I was supposed to interview somebody who was a member of that church a couple of different times, and the woman who came to me, actually her husband, had seen the lynch body. I have a video that I made 2 years ago of a white woman that I haven't put on video yet, but it's there. I'm probably going to put it on the website because I have a warning there. It's a horrific 2 minutes of her describing how her father, a barber, took her to see the lynch bodies of Bert and Morton because he wanted her to see what mob violence looked like when she was 7 years old.
What's that?
Mob violence. And she has a distinct memory of seeing that. She died about a month after I interviewed her. But it was so what I began to realize about 20 years ago is there were all these people, black and white, walking down the street, passing me, passing each other. I didn't know them, but they had heard these stories through their grandmother, their aunt, their uncle, whatever. They heard versions of the stories of the lynching. A lot of people hadn't heard it, but what I began to realize, a lot of them had, and they're passing it on. And that's influencing how people move and work and relate to one another. And sort of like, not the same, but when the prisoner says to the jailer, it's not good in here, it's not healthy, and the jailer says, this partner says, it ain't intended to be. But it's unhealthy. It's unhealthy for our culture. So the question becomes, so I made a choice not to show you the image. And things have changed a lot in the last few years. And it depends on the audience, the setting, and in the exhibit we have it cordoned off and it says guidance, if you enter in, this is their images of racial violence. So, and I think that seems to have worked. There's an article in the Smithsonian that's on my website that was written about the project, Smithsonian Magazine. You can see a reference to where something came up around this. But generally speaking, people in Mississippi responded amazingly to these photographs. And they did what I asked you to suggest. They found a place to enter in, regardless of who they are. Yes?
You had several pictures that looked like stereo photos of individuals, but they clearly were not.
Right. They're not stereo photographs.
It seemed kind of curious.
It's just the quality. I mean, it may have been a glass plate, the wrong glass maybe, and it may be just the quality of these negatives are very rich in their depth, just in terms of the density of what you can get out of it. That's all I can say.
Well, wasn't he also making use of a glass plate twice?
Well, yeah, the camera has glass and glass lens, but yes, you're talking about the split back.
Where there's two images side
Where
by
there are two
side?
images, is that what you were talking about? Where there's, like the guy that says Chicago bound?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's.
They're two, I mean, like, they look like identical pictures,
right.
but
So
they were not.
No. So there's a way that's 5 by 7, 5 inches by 7 inches, a piece of glass, and there's a little, essentially a door that gets moved back and forth. So one side is exposed and the other side is exposed. So it could be just a minute later. That's so intriguing that way. And it was also, sometimes people only have enough money to get one side, to pay for one side. And so that's why I say that the one that's ambiguous with the little white baby and the dark-skinned person next to him. We don't know if that's a caregiver or if just somebody only had 50 cents instead of $1, to have a picture made. Okay, well, y'all have been a great audience, and I'm happy to sign books if you want me to sign books. The website is thepruittproject.com. thepruittproject.com.